Welcome to the Brain People Podcast, a show where four mental health experts team up to bring you practical tools for overcoming mental health challenges. The Brain People don't replace your doctor or therapist, but we will give you some extra tools to help you on your journey. So join us as we fight mental illness, one episode at a time. Welcome to the Brain People Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Binus, and I'm a psychiatrist, and I'm joined today by Amanda
Anguish.
I always, since you're married, I always hesitate. I'm like, okay,
I haven't changed it yet.
So Amanda Anguish, yes, and we love that Anguish because we know that when you come and do therapy with Amanda, it's going to be some hard work.
It's like my shtick now. I can't not have it.
That's right. It's like your
my trademark.
Your trademark, exactly. So Amanda is a marriage and family therapist. And today's topic is going to be on dissociation. And this is something that I've struggled for years to spell correctly. And I still do. It's one of those words just spelled weird. But it's actually a very interesting and pertinent topic. And I think as we delve into it, our audience is going to start realizing, oh, wow, this is something that pertains to everybody on some level or another. So Amanda, would you be able to tell us a little bit about what dissociation actually is? What is that?
Yeah, so dissociation, I always want to say disassociation. I don't know why, but dissociation is merely, it's defined as separating from parts of yourself, but also separating from reality. So really the definition is just separate or apart. So
tell me a little bit more about when we're talking about the separate or apart, like what kind of symptoms, like how would we know that we're dissociating?
Yeah, well, most of us probably, when we think of dissociation, we think of like dissociative identity disorder, otherwise known as multiple personality disorder. And I don't tend to watch these movies, but I looked up some because I know this is what we all think of is like, oh, I watched that movie once and it was that person who had like 18 different personalities and one of those personalities was a, dark murderer and stuff. And we got to watch out for those. But in reality, that's not what we're typically talking about. That's like the extreme one in a bazillion situation. When we talk about dissociation, we're talking about just separating from things that might be difficult in our lives right now. A lot of people are doing this when they go home after work. What is one of the things you do? Switch on the TV.
Zone out.
Yeah,
right?
Zone out.
I don't want to deal with this difficult reality in my life.
Yeah, I want to separate from work. And so I'm going to go watch TV, or I want to separate from my family. So I'm going to grab a glass of wine or a beer or something so I can kind of check out for a moment. Or even sometimes shopping can be a way of like, I don't want to deal with all this other stuff. I'm just going to go to my happy place and I'm going to that Target or something and I'm going to spend way too much money, I know, by the time I leave, but it just gives me like my therapy for the moment.
Kind of a way to check out. So that's actually a form of dissociation.
Yeah.
Now, there are other aspects of it too. I mean, you think about people having, and it's interesting, you mentioned, by the way, with the dissociative identity disorder or multi-personality disorder, that's very rare. And that's very true. Actually, in all my years of psychiatry, I've actually only had, I think, probably one or two patients, and I've treated, hundreds of patients, right? And that truly have DID. It is actually very rare. It can happen.
I think I've only had one myself, and that was even just recently.
So what we actually see is we see that dissociation is actually kind of a spectrum, right? And so certainly there's kind of those choices that we make to almost purposely dissociate, and I think even like daydreaming would
staring at the wall blankly, that sort of thing.
And I think you see it especially like even with kids where they kind of have make-believe friends and this sort of thing. It's like they're kind of dissociating from a complete reality. So some of those, are like, okay, maybe not the best coping mechanism, but not horrible, but then it kind of seems like it goes along a spectrum where, I've had some people that have like tunnel vision, or they maybe start feeling disconnected from reality, even though they're not like in a different personality or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, Tell me a little more about that area of the spectrum of dissociation.
Yeah. So maybe something we have a little bit better understanding of is like, some people will say, "Oh, I'm so OCD." And they're
Hmm.
talking about like, I like to be organized. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you have that person that day in and day out has these routines and rituals that they can't leave the house without having them done. And it interrupts, their work life, their family life, and it causes them to be really frustrated. They can't seem to not think about it. That's the same way with dissociation. You can have the very seemingly neutral versions
Hmm.
of that
Hmm.
where, yeah, I'm just zoning out for a while. Honey, take out the trash. You never listen to me. But he might be dissociating because he had a long day at work and just another thing is just too much. And so he's zoned out or something. That's one,
It
form of
seems
it.
like certain husbands get really good at that for whatever reason. I don't
Moms
know
too,
why.
their
Right?
kids could be yelling at them and
Yeah,
it's like, "Honey, don't you hear the kids are yelling at you?" And
exactly.
it's like, "What?" you know, "You just woke me up from my, awake coma."
Hmm.
But on the other end of that is when, maybe somebody has had, severe childhood trauma, and dissociation is a coping skill
Hmm.
to separate themselves from that trauma, and they go into another place or they go into another persona of
Hmm.
sorts to be able to rationalize what's going on or to separate, to not feel the pain and that sort of thing. You could probably talk about, even the brain mechanisms of what's going on with that because, uh-huh.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mhm.
And I want to get to that in just a couple minutes
Mhm.
here. But what I've noticed too, and you mentioned, trauma, I have some clients that have experienced significant trauma. I think
Mhm.
we both do. And some of them will tell me things like, I drove and I have no idea. I don't remember anything. And
Mhm.
it's often after they're triggered in some way. And it's just like their conscious mind blanks out and they just have this lapse of time. But they were actually doing something like driving or maybe even having a
Mhm.
conversation or something. And they just totally blanked out and forgot. So it's like you said, it's that disconnection. It can be, the disconnected feeling from reality,
Mhm.
which we call derealization. It can be a disconnection from what we feel in our body, right?
Yeah.
Depersonalization.
Mhm.
And sometimes it's that tunnel vision or the feeling that time is stopping. You're in a time warp.
Mhm.
So there's kind of a lot of different symptoms, but certainly it's all disconnection when we're
Yeah.
talking about it.
Mhm.
So let's move on to talk a little bit about causes. And I know you mentioned trauma, but if you don't mind elaborating a little bit on the causes of dissociation, and really, it seems like trauma is probably the biggest one, right? So maybe talk a little bit about
Yeah.
why people would dissociate, why that's related to dissociation.
Yeah. So we have really resilient bodies and we have really resilient brains. If you meet some people, you'll know that because of what they put their bodies through, what they put their brains through, and they're still somehow alive after all of that. But there's only so much that the body can handle and so much that the brain can handle. And, we don't know based on who it is how much they can handle necessarily. But each person almost has that like tipping point where they get to that place. And usually it happens in childhood because when do we have the least amount of coping skills to handle
In
stuff?
childhood,
We
right?
don't have the words to say what's going on, or maybe we don't have access to the resources that we need. So our child brain goes, switches off, or we go to another place. Some people even jokingly call it their happy place,
Yes.
where they, i- we want to make fun of those sorts of things, but in reality, for some people, they have to go there to be able to endure what they're going through. And then because they've done that, now the brain knows, oh, hey, this works. This is my protection. This is my safe place. And then when anything, even on a lesser level, might happen, rather than deal with it consciously, they separate. and they go to that place, or they dissociate from it so they don't have to deal with it. So it starts out as something helpful to deal with the situation or the trauma, but then it can turn into a maladaptive behavior because I know too well how to go there, and now I don't know how to be in reality.
Yeah. No, and it's very interesting because as you're sitting there talking, I'm dissociating and thinking about how
back to the conversation.
No, but something related to the conversation. So I don't know if it's true. Yeah, I think it's kind of dissociation. Anyway, so what I was thinking about is my smartphone, right? So one time I had my smartphone, I was talking on it, and then I put it on the dashboard, and it was a really hot day in Southern California. And so it starts heating up, right? Well, what was interesting is that it got to a certain temperature, and what happened to that smartphone? It shut down. It actually would not work anymore.
Oh, that's a good analogy. Yeah.
And the reason for that is because they actually programmed that smartphone to shut down at a certain temperature and not work so that it could cool down. Otherwise, if the temperature just kept rising and I kept using it, or it kept getting hotter and hotter, then the whole thing could melt down and never work again, right?
Yeah, because it takes some heat already to make it work.
Exactly.
And it can't go past that point.
Yeah, and so I'm kind of thinking, with that self-protection from trauma, it's almost like our brain can only handle so much, and it's like almost heating up as we're dealing with trauma, and it's not even always in the moment, right? It's remembering the trauma, reliving the trauma.
Yeah.
And as those strong emotions are coming up, our brain, to protect itself, to prevent itself from like overheating and basically blowing a fuse, permanent brain damage, right?
Absolutely.
Let's shut down, let's dissociate, let's go to another place so that we can kind of cool down. Do you think that's a reasonable analogy?
Oh, absolutely. And unfortunately, though, it becomes a maladaptive thing because we keep going to it and we don't know how to be in reality anymore because it's served as a protection for us. And that's what we want to be careful of, or we want to, seek help if we get to that place. Now, a lot of us, we're inundated with all kinds of ways to dissociate. And so it becomes a little bit scarier now that, we might see the rates of dissociation rising because we have all kinds of technology to help us dissociate, but we don't even need that. Some people stay in bed and just stare at the wall because of that sort of thing. And then they find it really hard to function in a way that is normative to most people.
No, I think it's a great point because I'm sitting here thinking, well, dissociation can be protective when you're dealing with that trauma. But then if you keep going into dissociation, you never really, you stay stuck. You never progress, you never move through, and you just keep going into escape mode. And so what was at one point when you initially went through the trauma very helpful and protected you from having to deal with the full impact of what just happened becomes actually very stunting in the long run.
It's like floaties, you put floaties on because you don't know how to swim and your parents don't want you to drown in the pool if they turn away for a moment. But what happens if you never take the floaties off? It protects you, yes, but it also protects you from learning how to swim properly and feel confident in the water without those floaties.
Absolutely.
And so that's basically what dissociation can do at that trauma level. It can keep us from connecting with reality the way we would want to.
Yeah. And I love that analogy because in a lot of ways, I'm sitting here thinking, well, the parent kind of teaching that child to swim can be, in a way, almost like a therapist working with somebody that is struggling with a past trauma. And it's like, okay, well, while you're with me, you can take the floaties off and we can actually start learning to swim in the sea of reality and actually move through it, right? So that's really, really neat. Now, a couple of things that I thought was interesting as I was doing a little research on this topic was that there are, when we think about causes, of course, main thing is trauma, right? But then there's some other causes that I looked at that I think it would be really helpful for our listeners to be aware of that could, especially if you're predisposed to already some negative dissociation, you might really want to be careful to avoid these things because they could exacerbate some of that pre-existing dissociation. So one of those that I found in the research was actually hypnosis. So hypnosis in and of itself, I mean, that's kind of the definition of hypnosis, right? Is that we're dissociating from reality. We're going into an altered state of consciousness.
Yeah.
So that was one thing. And then, certain drugs like psychedelics, LSD, mushrooms, etc. Also same sort of deal.
And some of those people actually use those because of the alternate reality that they get to go into and dissociate from the pain or the reality of life that includes responsibilities and things like that. And then they miss out on the joy of overcoming in those responsibilities too.
That's actually a really good point. And it's interesting because, of course, we might use some of these things, whether it's hypnosis or drugs to kind of escape that pain. But then in the end, it just worsens the problem, right?
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I thought was interesting that I found in some of the research was actually meditation and certain types of meditation.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not here to demonize meditation. I think it can often be helpful, but there's certain types of meditation that can actually lead people to really altered states of consciousness. And that is actually the goal of a lot of meditation. And a lot of meditators describe feeling like they are in a different altered state of reality, that the time around them changes and all of this. And so again,
absolutely, yeah,
want to be careful of those things.
And I think that's important to share too, because not a lot of people realize that there isn't just one form of meditation. When we think of it, we think of sitting Indian style and Om and that sort of thing. But there's meditation on, positive things, like positive psychology encourages focusing on things that you're grateful for, meditating on the grateful things. And then for Christians, there's also meditation on God's word and his promises and what God can do for you. So there's many types of meditation. We don't want to say there's only one. And yeah, those can be helpful.
Absolutely. Now, Amanda, you mentioned something about what's going on in the brain with meditation. So maybe I'll just comment on...
Or dissociation.
I said meditation.
It's okay.
Too many...
Dissociating.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for catching me. So what just happened in my brain there was that instead of using my frontal lobe, which is like my focus, conscious presence and being in touch with reality, what happened was the autopilot part of my brain, which is actually the limbic area of my brain, limbic system, took over. And what we call that is basically bottom-up regulation instead of top-down regulation. And so, again, when it just starts to feel overwhelming to our frontal lobe, then we're going to tend to, the frontal lobe, the logical part of our brain, is going to tend to shut down, and we're just going to be more reactive on autopilot, so to speak. And a lot of that, when we're truly dissociated, isn't even going to be really registering with our memory. And so it's a very interesting experience.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you have any other thoughts on the effect of the brain, but it is an interesting thing how, our brain can just like kind of turn on and off the switch.
Yeah. There's good parts of our brain, and then there's parts of our brain that like are almost too helpful, that they help us out of things that we should really be working on. And so, yeah, dissociation is one of those things that the brain can do to go on autopilot, which is helpful if you have a lot of tasks to do and you've done them over and over again. But it's not helpful if you really need to think through it and process what's going on and even come up with a new solution for a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are some of the diagnoses when you think about mental health diagnoses that we might see dissociative type symptoms?
Yeah. So the one that we mentioned, which is like the popular one, is what used to be called multiple personality disorder, and now it's DID, or dissociative identity disorder. And that's basically when somebody, appears to have, whether they believe that they have multiple people within the brain. This isn't like a schizophrenic type of thing where somebody's talking outside to you. It's literally within your brain that you're having conversations with multiple identities, you would call it. And so that would be that. And sometimes people know that there are other people there, and some people don't realize that there are other identities involved and stuff. But then there's like dissociative amnesia, and that's typically, we all forget things that happen to us. That's, you could say, oh, I have amnesia. But dissociative amnesia typically has to do with maybe a traumatic event in our life that we forget, or a period of time. And sometimes it surrounds that traumatic event too, but it could be 5 years or so. And so typically, I think when I read about this, that a lot of times it has to do with like even a certain time in childhood that you don't remember that time. So that can be indicative of that. And then the third one that we were looking at was, I think you had already mentioned that too. You did. I wasn't dissociating during that, but you talked about the depersonalization and derealization. And that's when people have this, they typically mention that it feels like they're standing outside of themselves, looking in on what's happening to them versus being present and in the moment. Mm-hmm. And so they don't feel like themselves and they're outside of themselves, or they feel like it's not happening to them. They're sort of a spectator watching it happen. Mm-hmm. So. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which can be very uncomfortable, and it can be very disconcerting. I've had some patients who have had a lot of anxiety about that because it doesn't usually feel very good.
No, we all want to feel present.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, I've noticed that a lot of people that have borderline personality disorder, a lot of people that have PTSD, and even mood disorders like depression and bipolar, they often use dissociation in a way to kind of escape some of these really negative, intrusive thoughts or feelings that are basically unacceptable and they don't want to experience, and then they just zone out. And sometimes they might choose to do so, but a lot of times it's just like, again, your limbic system, the emotional part of your brain just takes over and says, this is too much. I don't want to deal with this. I'm going somewhere else.
Yeah. And I think that's something that is really helpful to those who are watching and listening to know that while our brain does want to protect us from things, there's helpful ways to do it, not just the unhelpful ways. So dissociation often looks like, the unhealthy things like the shopping or the, not being productive because we're zoning out and in our own imaginary world and those sorts of things, or we have all these different personalities that we're dealing with. But there are also some really helpful things that people can do to protect themselves that doesn't protect them from the good stuff too.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And on that note, why don't we just dive into what can we do to deal with dissociation in a healthy way? And I think we can talk about treatment for it, but then also I like your point that maybe not all dissociation is bad, especially if we're really dealing with a heavy trauma that we need to kind of take a break from and disconnect from, right? So what do we do when what kind of treatments can we have?
Well, I'm always going to go to the cognitive behavioral therapy because that's my thing.
That's right.
But
that's where the anguish comes in, right?
Yes, yeah. And we don't have to go into all the technical techniques and stuff to talk about that. But one thing that we can do is, and this is helpful with a therapist, of course, or somebody that understands this process, is when we think about certain traumatic memories, usually they're stored in a place where whenever we're triggered to think of them, we go to that protective place. But if somebody's there to talk us through, sometimes we can put those memories in a different place or in a different form because we're remembering them differently. Because think about it, if you go through an experience as a child, say you're 5 years old, even up to 11 years old, you're not going to have the same way of looking at it as you would today as an adult. So it might be helpful, even if it's a little troubling or disconcerting to have to think about those things, to go back and recognize that memory, but recognize it as an adult and reconstruct the memory in a way that makes more sense to a mature person versus an immature. And I'm not talking about
No,
immaturity
I get it.
in a bad way. But when you're a child, there are immature things that we do with our memories versus as an adult, there are more mature things that we can do with that memory, especially if we have somebody to help us.
Exactly. So we don't fear that we're going to just get kind of stuck in that trauma. And then we're making sense of what actually happened, even though it might still be a very terrible thing that happened. We're now having a little more of a sense of mastery and control rather than feeling like helpless and re-victimized.
Yeah. And if you want to see a person go back to their childhood self, take them back to their home and watch them with their family sometimes, and you become that child. But if you have somebody with you to say, like, hey, Amanda, or hey, Daniel, as you go into this situation, let's look at it. Remind yourself that you're an adult now. You're the same size as those people that you're dealing with. And how would you look at it in that way? That sort of thing can really help you, with that.
So besides cognitive therapy, what other sorts of things can we do to deal with dissociation?
Well, grounding is a really helpful one. And literally grounding is for this type of thing, because when you're dissociating, you're not in the here and the now, and grounding is to help you get in the here and now. We could go through like 100 different ways to ground, but just some simple ones, even just paying attention to all of the things that are in the room. I like to call it taking a mental catalog of what's around you, and you just go systematically, from right to left or left to right, top to bottom, and you just notice all of the things that are around you. That helps you. If you're, say, in school or in a meeting or something and you catch yourself dissociating, one of the best ways, just take notes.
Yeah.
If you're taking notes, that keeps you in the present. You don't have the time to go off because you're busy writing things down. You could do that in church if you dissociate. Sometimes I do that.
Now I understand why I'm such a fastidious note taker. It's because I tend to over there.
If I don't, I'm curing all the problems in my life, and I'm, dealing with that sort of thing. So exercise is a great way to do it. Noticing the things around you, like if you're on a hike or something, like, keeping track of like, oh, there's a little yellow flower over there. Oh, look at that tree. It's changed since the last time we were out here. That sort of thing is also helpful. Getting involved in hobbies, like healthy hobbies, doing a 3D model, or, especially doing with other people too, that can really help. One of the things that sometimes helps too, one of the things that I've thought about is, if you get triggered by a memory, one thing that I like to do, and visualization is what it's called, but I like to be specific about my visualization. For me, as a Christian, I like to think, where is God in this situation? Like if I'm going through a difficult time, like what might he be doing in the process of this, and how might he be watching and protecting or providing for me, or even growing me through the situation, versus just me being there all by my, lonesome, vulnerable and afraid, watching like, hey, there's a bigger picture of this, and God's there and taking care of me too. I
really like that. And in a way, I think that kind of helps me to understand a little bit better what you were saying earlier about the idea of maybe healthy dissociation, because we can't necessarily see God right here, but we can know by faith that he's still there, he's with us, and that he has a plan through this. And so, in my mind, I'm thinking, wow, okay, so if I'm dealing with something where I do need that mental break and escape, instead of maybe escaping to something or even someone that really can't help me, whether, it's watching TV or, maybe a drug or hypnotherapist or whatever, why don't I intentionally go to God?
Yeah.
Why don't I intentionally dissociate, if you will, meditate on his love for me, even though I can't see him right now, really trusting that he's there and he has good in mind for me.
Yeah, it's really neat to think about, you can separate in one way that may be unhealthy or doesn't give you the growth or something that you might want. But then you can also separate in a way that gives God the opportunity to put himself in the situation to take care of it while I'm watching now on the sideline, seeing how he's going to do his work in that situation. So prayer is a great way to do that. Even reading God's word, it's a way of, we like to see stories of people overcoming, and the Bible has many stories of people overcoming because they're watching God input himself as they separate themselves from.
Absolutely. And I even think about like the martyrs that were, many of them tortured or burned at the stake or whatever. And some of them, many of them were able to even sing hymns, and it seemed like, the pain didn't touch them. And so in a way, we think of some of these symptoms like dissociation, oh, it's all negative. It's like, no, there's a purpose for it. And I think that God can actually use it for a good thing in the end, if we're connecting with the right place during those times of where we need to dissociate. So, well, thank you, Amanda. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise on this topic, and I've learned a lot, and I hope our listeners have too.
Yeah.
And so we want to remind our listeners that dissociation is not necessarily a bad thing. It actually can be protective. It's, basically that separation when we're feeling overloaded. And it's most often happens with trauma. That's at the root. But there are things that we want to be careful of, like hypnotherapy, certain types of meditation, and drugs that can actually worsen it and make
technology
it.
too.
Technology, absolutely. But there are also ways to make sure that we're handling our dissociative tendencies in a healthy way. Like you said, the cognitive therapy, the grounding techniques. And then, when we really do need to dissociate and disconnect, that we're doing it in a healthy way, ideally rooted in a spiritual relationship with God. And then maybe even, like you said, going out into nature can be kind of a positive, like distraction, dissociation too. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah,
and
thank you.
Hope our listeners have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks for listening. To hear more episodes, find us on social media, or support us financially, visit thebrainpeoplepodcast.com.